On this episode of Doing the Most, we're making a blueberry melomel with 45 pounds of blueberries.
Homemade brews and various how-tos, everything from mead to roast, bake creation, fermentation, inebriation, doing the most.
The last time I did a big fruit bomb blueberry mead was when we launched this channel a few years ago. For many of you, that may have been the first Doing the Most video you ever saw. And while my editing has improved since then, and a lot of my mead making practices have improved since then, there's still some charm in that original video that launched the channel. So I wanted to revisit that recipe, and I did so a year ago. And it's been in the process and aging and waiting for bottles this whole time. And so my apologies that I didn't get to this sooner, but a good mead sometimes takes a little bit of patience. The original blueberry melomel that we made was made with the intention of kind of mimicking a Malbec style wine, except using blueberries instead of grapes and making it a mead instead of a wine, which I know probably sounds like a very bizarre goal or experiment, but it's what I wanted to do at the time, and I wanted to further work on that project with its second iteration. So for this one, instead of using just some fruit and a lot of water and a lot of honey, we're using all fruit and a lot of honey. We're also using a couple different types of honey, not just one type of honey, and we're doing something a little bit different with the acid in here. Originally I had used an acid blend, which is citric, malic, and tartaric acid. For this one, I am only using malic acid, and now I say that, we're also going to be pitching in a malolactic fermentation culture. So that bacteria culture is actually going to convert all of our malic acid into the softer and more delicate and refined lactic acid, whereas malic is kind of smooth and appley. Lactic is very soft, and some might say just a little bit buttery or silky. Now, blueberries themselves do have some malic acid in them. It can be anywhere from like 5 to 10-ish% of their acid profile, but our malolactic fermentation culture is going to convert all the malic acid into lactic acid, and that's going to give us that soft red wine kind of vibe. Additionally, we're going to hit it with a similar amount of oak that we did last time. In this iteration, we're using American oak, which has some big soft vanillins, and those vanillins and oak tannins will also contribute to a Malbec-y kind of vibe within this mead. So with all that hullabaloo out of the way, let's take a look at our ingredients. The ingredients for this blueberry melomel are 45 pounds of blueberries, juiced, 10 pounds of blueberry blossom honey, 4 pounds of buckwheat honey, 3 grams of malic acid, a malolactic fermentation culture, and Premier Rouge red wine yeast. In secondary, we will be adding 12 ounces of medium toast American oak chips, and we'll be back sweetening with just about 2 pounds of blueberry blossom honey. We're kicking this project off with 45 pounds of frozen blueberries. I got these blueberries from our local chef supply store. It's just a big wholesale food supply store, and these are nice big plump blueberries. And this is a project that I put off for a while, mostly because it was very expensive, but also because I wanted to make sure that I did it right. So a lot of plotting and research went into this project. We are going to be using frozen blueberries, and we're going to be doing a cold maceration on these in order to extract the juice, the tannin, and the color. You may have seen recently our video on a cherry mead that we made, and there were some questions about cold maceration, and so I wanted to take a minute here to explain what that is. Basically what we're doing is we're hitting this with some pectic enzymes, pectinase in this case, and those are going to help the fruit break down. But we want to do that in a cold environment. And that keeps us from feeling the need to add sulfites to prevent spoilage or prevent a wild fermentation from taking place, but also gives it some time, in this case about a week, in a cold environment for the pectinase to really work on that fruit and break it down. This cold maceration, as we call it, is preparing the fruit to be pressed. There are some styles of mead where this step isn't necessary, and those meads are being made with some pectin obliterating enzymes in there, but they're just being fermented with all the fruit in there and all the honey in there. We're taking a slightly different approach by doing our maceration in the week leading up to fermentation in a cold environment, in this case in an emptied out freezer that we're keeping just above freezing, and then moving from that maceration process onto the pressing and then the fermentation. So I quickly sanitized each of our bags and dumped those frozen blueberries in. A quick note here, you see us dunking whole bags of fruit into a bucket of sanitizer. That's because we're pretty confident that the bags are totally sealed. If you think your bag of fruit might have a leak in it, it's okay to just spray it down with sanitizer and make sure it's sanitized. We're doing this because we don't know who or what has touched this bag of fruit before it got to us, and this project is expensive, and so I want to take as many precautions as I can to prevent any spoilage or infection from happening. I had done the math based on some internet research and knew that 45 pounds of blueberries would net me about 4¼ gallons of fresh pressed blueberry juice. My goal was to make sure this mead came out to about 5¼ gallons, so when I rack it off to secondary, it would be right at about 5 gallons. I'm adding some pectic enzyme here for the cold maceration process. This is an enzyme that acts on fruit pectins. It's a natural enzyme, and it will help break down this fruit so that way we can get the best extraction possible. 45 pounds of blueberries fills up about 2 regular brewing buckets. But as those break down, we'll be able to combine them into one bucket. Over the course of several days, I used a sanitized potato masher to mash up our blueberries, and the juice that flows out of those will help carry that pectic enzyme around and continue breaking them down. Mash, mash, mash. And a few days later, we were ready to combine. So I opened those up and mashed them again, and then combined both buckets. And now we're getting somewhere. Then came the day for us to press out all of that juice. I'll be using a couple of different fruit press bags here. I'm just clipping this one onto the bucket and transferring the berries into it. And pretty much this is as simple as putting the bag of fruit into the fruit press and pressing it. The whole process took the better part of an hour. After I'd got the first bag of blueberries pressed down pretty far, I opened up the fruit press and put the rest of my berries into a different bag and loaded that on top. And then using some added spacers that I cut myself to complement the existing spacers that came with the fruit press, I cranked the sucker down and pressed out as much juice as I could get. The next day, when that had come up to room temperature, it was time to mix in all the other ingredients. Anna's sister was here to help me out, and I put her in charge of scooping the crystallized blueberry blossom honey into the bucket. Of course, we're also adding some buckwheat honey so we can get a nice, big, earthy, rich back end on this mead. Buckwheat honey. It's polarizing, and many of you may be thinking, why in the heck would you be adding buckwheat honey into a blueberry melomel, especially when you're using so much blueberry blossom honey already? And that's because I wanted to add a little undercurrent of depth, a little earthiness, almost a little dirtiness to this mead. And that's mimicking some of what you might sense in a malbec when it's got those really earthy, mineral-rich soil conditions that find their way up into the flavor of the grape and the grape skins. So buckwheat honey for this, probably an unconventional choice, and for some folks who have a real knack for picking out buckwheat honey, they might not want it in this mead, but I feel like it gives just enough je ne sais quoi that it gives it an added layer of complexity and depth that is kind of interesting and complements the other big, bold, fruity tannic notes really well. And I decided to take a cautious approach and add just a little bit more pectic enzyme to help along with clearing. Then I added our malic acid, and we're adding this because we're using a malolactic fermentation culture in here, and we want a little bit more malic acid in the mix for that bacteria to convert into lactic acid. Stir, stir, stir. And we're also going to be adding some OptiRed. OptiRed is a natural yeast derivative that helps with color retention, as well as tannin integration and a couple of other things. And it's perfectly suited for a big fruit melomel like this. We gave that a few hours to come together a little bit before we rehydrated our yeast. Here I am using GoFirm, which is a yeast rehydration nutrient. It's a natural product that gives the yeast some vitamins and other nutrients and aids in making sure that when that yeast rehydrates, it's sucking in a bunch of good stuff. So it's got a nice, healthy rehydration right from the start. And we're using 2 5-gram packs of our yeast, so we start with a nice, healthy cell count at the beginning. That comes together, and we'll just leave that for about 15 or 20 minutes as the yeast rehydrates. I stirred a little bit more just to make sure everything was nice and mixed up, and then added our malolactic fermentation culture. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we are doing a malolactic fermentation culture. This is a bacteria that we're pitching in here alongside our yeast. So while our yeast are converting fermentable sugars into alcohols, the malolactic fermentation bacteria is going to be converting malic acid into lactic acid. So that's why we added a little bit more malic acid to this. We could have added lactic acid. There is a liquid form of lactic acid that we could have added, but I like the idea of a biological process converting our malic acid into lactic acid. For me, it just feels more authentic to the craft, and so that's why we're doing that here. For a mead like this, some folks might choose a yeast like 71B that uses a maloethanolic pathway to convert malic acid into ethanol. So it's not converting the malic acid into lactic acid like we're doing with this bacterial culture, but it's actually just kind of removing malic acid from the mix and softening the acid profile of the mead that way by basically removing some of the malic acid flavor, not all of it, just some of it from the mead. 71B is not a bad choice for a big berry mead if you do want to kind of polish some of the harshness off of the acid profile. However, it only does it just slightly. Typically, it's going to convert somewhere around 15 to 20% of the malic acid in your must. I think that a malolactic fermentation culture is a better route for something like this, and again, it's just kind of a more interesting thing to do in making this mead. Sometimes folks will add their MLF culture after primary fermentation has finished. Others will co-ferment alcoholic fermentation and MLF at the same time. My reading has led me to believe that a co-fermentation is a smoother and gentler process, and so that's what I prefer to do when I pitch an MLF culture. Your mileage may vary, and malolactic fermentation usually takes about 6 to 8 weeks on average. Took our hydrometer reading here, and our hydrometer read at 1.122. So it's time to pitch the yeast, and that rehydrated yeast goes right in. Lid goes on, and we'll see it again in 24 hours. 24 hours later, we started our TOSNA nutrient schedule. This will be 4 nutrient additions over the first 5 days or so. Check the link in the description for information about how to calculate your staggered nutrient additions. Here we're using Fermade-O as our yeast nutrient. We'll make sure all those nutrients go in before the 1/3 sugar break. About a month later, primary fermentation had finished right at 1.000, but our malolactic fermentation may still be going on in there. So we're not going to do anything to stabilize it just yet. We want to make sure that MLF is allowed to run its course. Here we are about 3 months later, and we're going to rack this another time and add some oak. As you can see here, our secondary vessel does not really have enough room for oak chips. So our American oak goes in, and we're just going to leave this on the oak for a few weeks. I didn't want to over oak it, but I did want to get a pretty big, heavy malbec-y oak in there. Some of the best malbecs I've had have been heavy oaked, not a delicate oak, but a heavy oak that really plays against the fruitiness in the Malbec grape. I wanted a big oak profile here that was going to soften but also play against the blueberries. 12 ounces probably seems like a lot of medium toast oak chips, but that's what I wanted to do because I wanted to get the oak in there quick and get it back off of that oak and kind of just be done with the oaking process so I could put this away into bulk aging and just forget about it for a while. So I used a considerable amount of oak, which is a lot of surface area exposure to that oak, but I only had it in there for a few weeks just so it could get in there and do its thing. I tasted it along the way after about the 1 week mark, and when the oak got just a little bit past where I wanted it, that was when I knew it was time to rack it off and get that back sweetened. I find that oak in a mead or wine like this tends to mellow out just slightly with age, so I always like to push my oak just a little farther than I think I need, knowing that some of that is going to back off as it sits in the bottle and ages. Some of the best Malbecs I've ever had have been big oaky ones, not kind of tame fruity Malbecs, but ones where the oak really stands up against that big fruity flavorful grape. And so that is what I was trying to mimic with this mead. So a few weeks later, once that oak has had some time to flavor up our mead, we are going to stabilize with potassium sorbate and potassium metabisulfite. This moment here requires a quick warning. Using sorbate when you have an active malolactic fermentation going on can create some nasty rotting flower geranium flavors in your must. As I mentioned earlier, malolactic fermentation typically takes like 6 to 8 weeks to complete. It can take even longer. It can take 12 weeks or more to complete. And so you really just kind of want to give your mead some time. Give it some space. You really want to let that malolactic fermentation culture get in there, do its work, convert all that malic acid for you, and die off and leave you the heck alone before you ever even consider chemically stabilizing with sorbate. I have used sorbate on fermentations several times that have had an MLF culture in there. I've always given them plenty of space to make sure that finishes up, and I've never personally experienced those rotten geranium flavors. Your mileage may vary, but this rule of thumb of really giving it some time should prevent any of those flavors. If you're worried about it, you could use a non-fermentable sugar to back sweeten instead of using honey. But for something like this, I really wanted to back sweeten with honey, so I was happy to take that risk, adding sorbate. It had been months since I pitched that malolactic fermentation culture in there, so I personally wasn't worried about it at all. Then 48 hours after that, we're going to rack it off again, and this time we're going to get it back sweetened. And as mentioned previously, we are back sweetening with more blueberry blossom honey. Honey goes in. And we rack it off. Then we will very gently stir, being careful to try not to break the surface tension of the mead, and just make sure that honey kind of gets mixed throughout there in the bottom. Then this is just gonna go away for a while, like months and months. So here we are the following winter, getting this bottled up. Filled my hose with sanitizer, and I'm just running that sanitizer out to get our siphon going. And then we'll bottle this up in these beautiful blue wine bottles. And And there we have it, a nice case of blueberry mead, about a year from yeast pitch to packaging. Yes, this is 1 year old at this point, but we're gonna go ahead and do a tasting anyway. I do think that probably another 6 months to a year is gonna be when this one hits its stride, but it wouldn't be fair to take you through this whole video, walk you through this whole process without cracking one open to see what it tastes like. Oaky. It definitely retained a lot of its big red color, though it did clear out really nicely. There's just a touch of brown in there, which I am confident is from that big dark buckwheat honey. It tends to leave just a little bit of kind of a rustiness in your red meads, which I don't find off-putting, but some might see as a sign of potential oxidization. I can tell you for sure, this ain't oxidized. On the nose, it smells like blueberries. You can smell the blueberry blossom honey actually is really what fills your nose, but also just a heavy-handed oak. You ever been to a wine tasting and you get to the end of the tasting with those big bold reds and you sniff it and you just know it's gonna be a nice kind of puckering astringency? Yeah, that's what you get on this. Let's dive in. It's so cohesive. The softness of that lactic acid is there, and it doesn't make up a huge portion of the acid profile in here, but it's just enough that you get that velvety kind of silk acid profile across the middle of your tongue. The oak tannin in this has really died down even in the few weeks since I bottled this. You can feel it right on the sides of your tongue, just a little bit dipping down into the sides of your mouth. Man, it really claws at the inside of your mouth. The tannin doesn't let go, which is really nice because it carries that blueberry flavor all around. It drinks like a wine. It doesn't have a big jamminess like you get in some of those huge fruit bomb meads. It does definitely have a viscosity in there that is attributable to the honey that we back sweetened with, but it's delicate. It drinks like a wine with an exhale of honey. It's very close to mimicking what I'd love to eventually perfect in a Malbec mimicking melomel. I think possibly more could be done to bring out the blueberry notes if that's what you wanted, including fermenting on the pomace, the stuff left over after you've pressed the juice. Just bag that on up and throw it into the fermenter and ferment on that, and that would help, I think, give it a little bit more oomph behind the fruit profile on this. I do think it does a good job of balancing that fruity wininess while also letting the drinker know, yes, this is made with honey, this is a mead, and it doesn't kind of mince words either about what's in here. You know there's honey and there's blueberries and there's tannin, and it's pretty clear that the tannin comes from oak. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. You can follow us on all the things, including joining our Discord server where all the coolest folks on the internet hang out. And thank you for subscribing to the channel. If you haven't subscribed, I don't hold that against you. You can do it right now. Just go click the subscribe button under this video, ring that bell for notifications, and you'll never miss another Doing the Most video. We have new content out every Friday. Until next time, happy brewing, happy fermenting, happy aging, and cheers.